are multiple talents and there are multiple temperaments, and that's where the Big Five model comes in. So people differ in extroversion, and extroverts are more likely to be good at sales jobs. People differ in negative emotionality, despite what the California Labor Board ruled yesterday. People differ in sensitivity to negative emotion. Women are more sensitive on average to negative emotion than men, and the effect size of that is something like if you took a random woman and a random man out of the population and you had to lay a bet on who had higher levels of anxiety and emotional pain, and you bet that it was the woman, you'd be right 60% of the time. So it's an interesting stat because men and women are more the same in in sensitivity to negative emotion than different, but there's a offset at the mean. And what that also means is that if you took the top 100 people, top 1 in 100 people who are the most sensitive to negative emotion, they'd almost all be women. Now, you see the inverse of that in some sense with regards to criminality. So males are more aggressive than females, and it's about the same difference. If you take a random woman and a random man out of the population, you had to bet on who was the most aggressive. If you bet it was the man, you'd be right 60% of the time, which isn't that much of the time, right? It's deviation from 50-50, but it's not 90-10. It's just 60-40. But if you take the 1 in 100 persons who's most aggressive, and that's the person you throw in prison, by the way, they're all men. 9 out of 10 of them are men. And so one of the things, and this goes to the complexity argument that you were talking about earlier, that it's hard for people to have a multivariate discussion because we like to collapse things into single causes. But it's also hard for people to understand the statistical reality of distributions, because you can have two distributions that almost entirely overlap and have walloping differences at the tails.
Yep.
And the tails are where all the action is. Like, who cares how aggressive you are? As long as you don't shoot or stab someone, you get to be aggressive. But if you're so aggressive that you shoot or stab someone, then you end up in prison, and you're the person that we're concerned with. And maybe that's 1% of the population. It's like, yeah, well, they're all men. And you see, this happens in less dramatic form, too, when you look at phenomena like career selection. So there's just a data set released the other day, and this is the first time I'd seen this, showing quite clearly that this is a remarkable finding, and it builds on some earlier research, which the California Labor Board also decided was pseudoscience, which is absolutely 100% not pseudoscience. That is so wrong. No serious scientists debate the data that I'm describing. That nobody has debated it since like 1990. So it's very well settled science. If you look at career choices between men and women, what you find is that they're driven in large part by temperamental differences. So that would be in the Big Five: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, and also by interest. Because the biggest difference between men and women that's been measured psychometrically, forget about the physical differences, but the psychological differences, is difference in interest. And it's actually pretty big. And so men, on average, are more interested in things, and women, on average, are more interested in people. And it's a 1 standard deviation difference, which is a big difference by the standards of these sorts of differences. And it's enough to drive a couple of phenomena. Phenomena 1. Most nurses are women. Phenomena 2, most engineers are men. Why? Has nothing to do, or very little to do, if any, with differences in mathematical reasoning ability. And I mean, that's been tracked too. So if you take junior high kids, men and women, girls and boys, and you take only those who are off the charts in terms of their mathematical interest, the gender difference isn't that great. There's a tiny edge for boys, but not much. And it's even disputable whether that edge exists. So let's assume it doesn't, for the sake of argument. If you track those kids across time, what you find is a disproportionate number of the men go into the STEM fields and hardly any of the women. And the reason is they're good at it, but they're not interested in it. So and then you might think, well, that's sociocultural, right? We could change that. It's like, no, sorry, research has already been done. So imagine you could rank order countries by how gender neutral their socioeconomic policies were. And then you put the Scandinavian countries at the top for obvious reasons, because they've been pushing that for like 4 decades, and have made a lot of progress with it. The biggest differences in temperament and interest in the world between men and women are in the Scandinavian countries. And the data now have revealed that there's a correlation between how gender neutral the country is and how big the differences are between the men and women, and the difference is positive, not negative. And then you think, well, is that reliable science? Or are the right-wing conservatives driving this scientific agenda? And the answer to that is, there are no right-wing conservatives in psychology. There are none. I'm dead serious, man. I'm dead serious about that. So here's why this research is reliable. It's because the research is reliable because the people who generated the findings hated them. They hated the findings. They were completely biased in the other direction because everyone was hoping, everyone who's a social scientist was hoping that as you flattened out the gender differences in the sociological landscape, you would decrease the personality differences, the individual differences, and that's not what happened. You maximize them instead. It's like, that wasn't what we expected. And believe me, people just didn't run to the publisher and publish these data sets. They were shocked by them. And so they replicated them, and these have been replicated across samples of tens of thousands of people and dozens of countries. It's extraordinarily reliable. It is, as far as I'm concerned, apart from the hard biological end of psychology, where there's some unbelievably solid work done, it's the most solid social science that exists, as far as I can tell, the psychometric data. And the reason I think that is when I was starting my career, I was looking for the most solid data, because one of the things I wanted to do was learn how to predict how people's lives transformed and changed and across time and what sort of level of achievement they managed. So I was looking for the most reliable and valid measures. And it's clearly the psychometric measures are the most reliable and valid, period. No one disputes that. So except people in women's studies, and that just doesn't count.